Some people wear their greed like a designer perfume. You smell it the moment they walk into the room. That's exactly what happened the Sunday Serena Voss sat across from me at my own dining table. Cut into my best roast lamb, complimented my home with that rehearsed smile of hers, and then, without so much as blinking, told me she needed $500,000 for her wedding. My wedding, apparently. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this whole thing started. Because trust me, you're going to want every single detail. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Oscar Stafford, retired, 61 years old. For 32 years, I worked as a fraud investigator for one of the largest financial crime units in the country. I have sat across tables from con artists so polished, so convincing, that their own mothers would have handed over a bank account. I have watched people smile at me while lying through every single tooth in their heads. So when my son Blake called me on a Thursday evening, voice cracking with that particular kind of excitement that only belongs to young men who think they've just discovered something the rest of the world missed, I paid attention. "Dad," Blake said, "I met someone. I was in my recliner. The evening news was on. Judith was in the kitchen doing what Judith does, making everything smell incredible and pretending she wasn't eavesdropping." "Met someone," I repeated, turning the TV volume down just enough. "She's different, Dad. She's really, really different." Now I want to pause right here and ask every parent listening, how many times have you heard those exact words? She's different. He's different. No, Dad, you don't understand. This one is different. I said what every wise father says in that moment. Bring her to Sunday lunch. She arrived in a white sundress that probably cost more than my first car. Serena Voss, 31 years old, according to Blake, smooth skin, sharp eyes, a handshake so confident it almost made me like her. Almost. Judith, bless her heart, was already in love. Within 4 minutes of Serena walking through our front door, my wife of 35 years was showing this woman our family photo albums. Photo albums. The ones I'm not even allowed to look at unsupervised. Blake was glowing, standing just slightly behind Serena the entire time, like a man who couldn't believe his own luck. And that, right there, was the first thing that bothered me. Not the dress. Not the handshake. The fact that my son, a confident, sharp young man I raised to stand in every room like he belonged there, was suddenly operating like Serena's shadow. I filed that away. We sat down to lunch. Judith had made roast lamb, rosemary potatoes, the kind of meal that makes people emotional. Frank Delano, my oldest friend, 30 years on the force before he retired, sitting at the far end of the table with a glass of iced tea and the most convincingly bored expression a man has ever worn, gave me a small nod when Serena wasn't looking. Frank and I had a system. We'd developed it over decades. It required no words. I noticed how Serena ate, controlled, deliberate, watching portions. Not because she was watching her figure, because she was watching us. Every bite is calculated, every compliment timed. "This is absolutely beautiful, Mrs. Stafford," Serena said, gesturing around the dining room. "Oscar, you've built something really wonderful here." "We built it," I said, nodding toward Judith. 35 years of bad decisions and good luck. Everyone laughed. Serena laughed the loudest and the longest. 2 beats too long. Filed away. Blake reached across and squeezed Serena's hand. She squeezed back without looking at him. Filed away. Frank helped himself to more potatoes and said absolutely nothing. "Here's what I want you to understand about a professional con artist, and I mean a good one. They never rush. That's what separates the amateurs from the ones who actually scare you. An amateur comes in hungry, impatient, makes their move too early and too obviously. A professional makes you feel the relationship before they make you feel the ask. They build warmth. They make you invest. They make you like them before they cost you anything." Serena Voss was a professional. She spent the first 40 minutes of that lunch being utterly charming. She asked Judith about her garden. She asked me thoughtful questions about my career. Not the intrusive kind, the flattering kind. She laughed at the right moments. She touched Blake's arm just enough to look devoted without looking theatrical. And then, right as Judith was clearing the first round of plates, right as the table was relaxed and full and warm and liquid with good food and easy conversation, Serena set her wine glass down, folded her hands, and smiled at me. Oscar, she said, I want to talk to you about the wedding. I leaned back in my chair. Of course you do. Blake and I have been talking, and we both agree we only want to do this once. We want it to be everything. She paused for exactly the right amount of time. We're looking at a budget of around $500,000. The table went quiet. Now, I need you to understand what silence sounds like in a room full of people who all react differently to a bomb. Judith's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Frank slowly put his iced tea down with the careful precision of a man who has just been told something he already knew. Blake, my Blake, stared at his plate. And then, very slowly, my son looked up, and he looked directly at me. Not at Serena, not his mother. At me. And before I could open my mouth, before I could arrange my face into any particular expression, I felt something slide across the tablecloth. Slow. Deliberate. Hidden under the casual cover of Blake reaching for the breadbasket. A folded napkin. I picked it up without looking at it, set it in my lap, and I smiled at Serena Voss, the wide, warm, slightly overwhelmed smile of a proud father who has absolutely no idea what's happening. Well, I said, that's quite a number. Serena's smile didn't waver. We want to do it right. Of course, I said. Of course you do. Under the table, I unfolded the napkin with one hand. 4 words, written in Blake's handwriting, pressed hard into the paper the way you write something urgent. Dad, she's a scammer. I want you to imagine for just a moment what it feels like to read those words and have to keep smiling. To sit across from a woman who is still talking, something about venues, something about a date in the spring, while your son's warning is sitting in your lap and your oldest friend is quietly watching you from the other end of the table, and your wife is asking about flowers. I have been in rooms with dangerous people. I have interviewed fraudsters who stole retirement funds from elderly widows. I have sat across from men who looked me in the eye and lied with a clarity that was almost artistic. But nothing prepared me for the specific particular effort it took to sit at my own dining table, with my son's handwritten note in my lap, and say, Serena, tell me more about yourself. Because here's the thing she didn't know. Here's the thing nobody at that table knew except Frank. I hadn't just invited her to Sunday lunch. I had been waiting for her for 3 weeks. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you. Genuinely. That was me. Right there at my own dining table. Roast lamb going cold on my plate. Serena Voss still talking about spring venues and floral arrangements, and whether the reception should be indoors or outdoors. And I'm nodding, smiling, asking the occasional question, the perfectly overwhelmed future father-in-law. Meanwhile, inside my head, 32 years of instinct was running at full speed. Let me take you back, because you need to understand what those 3 weeks looked like before that Sunday ever arrived. It started with a phone call. Not from Blake. From a former colleague of mine, a woman named Patricia Owens, 26 years in financial crimes, currently consulting for 3 federal agencies simultaneously. Patricia called me on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual, because Patricia does not make casual phone calls. Patricia communicates the way a surgeon operates, only when necessary, and always with precision. Oscar, she said, does the name Serena Voss mean anything to you? I was in my garage at the time, reorganizing a shelf of tools I had no intention of using. I stopped moving. My son's girlfriend, I said. A pause. Oscar. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that arrives before information you would genuinely prefer not to have. How serious is it? I set down the wrench in my hand very carefully. Patricia. Talk to me. What she told me over the next 40 minutes restructured everything I thought I knew about the woman my son had been dating for 4 months. Serena Voss. Real name, real background, but a very, very curated public face. 2 years prior, she had been peripherally connected to an investigation in Phoenix, a wealthy family, an engagement, a requested sum of money, $420,000, for a wedding that was planned in extraordinary detail and never held, because 2 weeks before the transfer was finalized, Serena had quietly disappeared. No charges, not enough for charges. She was careful, carefully careful, the way only experienced people are careful. Nothing in her name. Nothing that stuck. 18 months before Phoenix, there had been a situation in Nashville. Different name used. Similar pattern. Older family. Substantial sum requested. Engagement dissolved under circumstances the family declined to discuss publicly. Patricia couldn't confirm everything, but she had enough. She's evolved, Patricia told me. She's gotten better, more patient, longer runway before the ask. How long was Blake's runway? I asked. 4 months, Oscar. That's longer than both previous cases. I stood in my garage for a long time after we hung up, and then I called Frank Delano. Frank and I had worked together for 19 years before we both retired. If you looked at Frank Delano, you would see a 63-year-old man with a forgettable face, a comfortable stomach, and the conversational energy of a man waiting for a bus. That is entirely intentional. Frank is the single most perceptive human being I have ever encountered in my life, and he has spent 6 decades making absolutely sure nobody knows it. Tell me what you need, Frank said when I finished explaining. Sunday lunch, I said. I need you at the table. I need eyes I trust. Done, he said. What's the play? We let her do it. I want the full picture before we move. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, she's going to ask for money. Yes, she is. At the table, she's patient, but she's not infinite. Blake told me 2 days ago he was thinking about proposing. She knows the window. She'll move at lunch. Another pause. Does Blake know? And that, right there, was the question that had been sitting on my chest like a stone for 3 weeks. My son. My 28-year-old son who called me with a cracked voice and said, Dad, I met someone. Who stood behind her in my living room like a man who couldn't believe his luck. Did Blake know? I don't know yet, I told Frank, and I can't ask him without tipping everything. Oscar, Frank's voice was level, careful. If he doesn't know, if he's genuinely in love with this woman, then Sunday lunch is going to be one of the worst days of his life. I know, I said. You ready for that? I looked around my garage for a long moment, at the shelf of tools, at the old photograph on the workbench, Blake at 9 years old holding up a fish he'd caught, grinning like the whole world was a gift. No, I said honestly, but I'll be ready anyway. So, back to the dining table, back to Serena's spring venues and my nodding smile and Frank's iced tea. Under the table, Blake's note was folded in my hand. Dad, she's a scammer, he knew. My son knew. And instead of walking away, instead of confronting her himself, he had done the smartest thing possible. He had gotten to the table, kept his composure, and passed the problem to the one person he trusted most. I felt something shift in my chest. Pride, I think. Quiet, enormous pride. I looked at my son across the table. He was watching Serena with an expression I now recognized completely. Not devotion. Endurance. The careful, controlled expression of a young man performing a role while his stomach is in knots. How long had he known? How long had he been carrying this alone? I gave him nothing. No signal, no nod. Just the mild, pleasant face of a father listening to wedding plans. Because Serena was still watching me, and Serena was very, very good at reading faces. But she wasn't as good as she thought. Oscar, she said, steering the conversation back like a ship returning to port. I know 500,000 is a significant number. I want you to know Blake and I have thought about this seriously. This isn't impulsive. I can see that, I said warmly. You strike me as a very thoughtful young woman, Serena. She smiled, gracious, measured. We'd be looking at a venue deposit within the next 30 days, so timing does matter a little. There it is, the timeline. The gentle pressure wrapped in silk. 30 days, creating urgency without appearing urgent. I had seen this exact technique in a deposition in 2009. Different person, same architecture. Judith looked at me. She had been quiet for several minutes, which for Judith is the emotional equivalent of shouting. Oscar, my wife said carefully, maybe we should. 35 years of marriage means a look is a full conversation. She sat back. I turned to Serena. I folded my hands on the table. I gave her my warmest, most disarming smile, the one I had used in approximately 340 interviews over a 32-year career. Serena, I said, before we talk numbers, I'd love to know a little more about your family, your background, where you're from. I tilted my head slightly. Humor an old man. The smile stayed on her face, but something behind her eyes, something very small, very quick, shifted. A recalibration, barely visible. But I'd spent 3 decades looking for exactly that. Frank at the far end of the table reached for his iced tea. That was his signal. He'd seen it too. Serena opened her mouth to answer my question, and that's when her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it reflexively, and in the half second before she flipped it face down, I saw the name on the screen. Not a contact name. A number. One I recognized. Because 3 days ago, Patricia Owens had run every associated number in Serena's known network and sent me the list. That number was on the list, which meant someone was coordinating with her. Right now. From outside this house. Monitoring the progress of this lunch like a project manager checking in on a deal. Serena wasn't working alone. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip, set it down. "Everything all right?" I asked pleasantly. "Perfect," she said, smooth as glass. "Just my sister." I smiled. She doesn't have a sister. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. I had been waiting 32 years for a moment this personal, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. Let me tell you what was already in motion before that Sunday lunch ever began. 3 days after my call with Patricia, Frank and I had sat in my garage with 2 coffees and a legal pad and built the architecture of what we were about to do. Not just expose Serena Voss. Exposure alone was too thin, too easy, too forgettable. She had walked away from Phoenix. She had walked away from Nashville. She was careful enough, clever enough, and patient enough to keep walking away indefinitely. We weren't going to expose her. We were going to end her. Patricia had spent 2 weeks quietly reaching back out to the Phoenix family, then the Nashville family. Both had been too humiliated to press forward originally. That's how this particular con works, by the way. The shame of being deceived is weaponized against the victim. People would rather absorb the loss quietly than stand in public and announce they were fooled. But Patricia is extraordinarily persuasive when she needs to be. Both families agreed to cooperate. Meanwhile, Frank had made 3 calls of his own. 1 to a contact at the district attorney's office, 1 to a federal financial crimes unit he'd worked with in 2014, and 1, the most important one, to a quiet, unremarkable man named Thomas Webb, who had spent 20 years doing the kind of investigative work that never appears on any official record, and who had spent the past 10 days doing a very thorough excavation of every financial account, alias, and associate connected to Serena Voss. Thomas had found the partner, the number on Serena's phone, a man named Garrett Sims, 44 years old, based out of Atlanta, with a history that made Serena's look like a minor footnote. Garrett was the architect. Serena was the instrument. He found the targets, built the profiles, monitored the operations in real time, and managed the money once it moved. They had done this 7 times across 5 states. 7 families. Thomas had the paper trail. All of it. So when Serena told me the buzzing phone was her sister, I smiled the way you smile at someone reading from a script you wrote yourself. "Of course," I said. "Family checking in. I completely understand." Deliberately, with a small sound of effort that I may have slightly exaggerated. And I picked up my wine glass. "Actually," I said, "I think this calls for something better than wine. I have a bottle in my study I've been saving for a genuinely special occasion." I looked around the table warmly. "I think this qualifies, don't you?" Judith looked at me with the focused attention of a woman who knows her husband extremely well and is now 90% certain he is up to something. Blake looked at me with the desperate, searching expression of a man clinging to a life raft. Serena looked at me with that practiced warmth and said, "Oscar, you don't have to do that." "I absolutely do," I said. And then, to the table in general, "Frank, come give me a hand, would you? My back's been terrible this week." Frank's back was completely fine. Frank knew that. I knew that. And Frank stood up with the slow, obliging energy of a man doing a small favor, and followed me down the hallway toward my study. The moment we turned the corner, completely out of eyeline, I looked at him. He nodded once. I took out my phone and sent a single text. 3 words. Table is set. We were back in the dining room within 4 minutes, bottle of bourbon in hand, Frank carrying glasses with theatrical effort. Judith had moved to the kitchen to prepare dessert. Blake was refilling the water pitcher. Serena was at the table alone. And I absolutely noticed, that her phone was in her hand, not face down on the table. She put it away the moment she heard our footsteps. I set the bourbon down, poured 4 glasses with a generous celebratory hand, passed them around as Judith returned, as Blake sat back down as the table reassembled itself into the warm picture of a family Sunday. I raised my glass. "To Blake," I said, looking at my son with genuine, uncomplicated love. "And to new beginnings." Everyone drank. Serena drank too, eyes bright, shoulders relaxed. She was close now. She could feel it. The warm patriarch, the emotional toast, the expensive bourbon. These were the closing signals she had been trained to read. The money was 48 hours away, maybe less. She had no idea that outside my house, parked 2 streets over, was a vehicle containing 2 federal agents, one representative from the district attorney's office, and Thomas Webb with a hard drive containing 7 cases worth of financial documentation. She had no idea that Patricia Owens was at that exact moment on a video call with the Phoenix family and the Nashville family, both of whom had signed formal cooperation agreements 48 hours ago. She had no idea that the number she'd been texting all afternoon, Garrett Sims, her partner, her architect, had been picked up by Atlanta PD at 11:15 that morning on an outstanding warrant that Thomas had very helpfully brought to their attention 6 days ago. Garrett Sims was not on the other end of that phone. He hadn't been since breakfast. I set my bourbon glass down, folded my hands, and looked at Serena Voss with the same calm, unhurried expression I had used at the beginning of every significant interview of my 32-year career. "Serena," I said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not being entirely honest with you today." I paused. "You see, I told you I retired." "That's true, but I didn't mention that retirement for a man like me is a fairly relative concept." Something shifted behind her eyes, barely perceptible, the first ghost of unease. "I'm not sure I follow," she said with a light laugh. "Let me help," I said pleasantly. "Phoenix, Arizona. 2 years ago. The Collin family. $420,000 requested. Engagement dissolved." I watched her face. "Nashville, Tennessee. 30 months before that. The Merritt family. Similar pattern. Different name used." I tilted my head slightly. "Should I keep going? Because Thomas has 5 more. And frankly, he's thorough to the point of being exhausting." The table was absolutely silent. Serena's face, and I want to give her full credit here, because she was genuinely exceptional, held its composure for almost 4 full seconds. That is a long time, when every word you've just heard is a wall closing in. 4 seconds of almost miraculous stillness, and then it cracked. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, with tears or shouting or a chair scraping back. It was quieter than that. Her eyes changed. The warmth drained out of them the way color drains from a face in cold water. What was left was something flat and assessing and entirely different from anything she had shown us all afternoon. The real Serena Voss, briefly, involuntarily, visible. "I don't know what you think you—" "Garrett Sims," I said, "was arrested in Atlanta at 11:15 this morning." I said it the way you read a weather forecast. Calm, factual, inevitable. The number he was coordinating from, the one you've been texting since you sat down at this table, has been monitored since Wednesday. I paused. "Your sister, I believe you called him." The silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever heard inside my own home. Blake set his water glass down very carefully. Judith sat very still, hands folded in her lap, with the quiet iron composure of a woman who raised a good son and trusted her husband, and was now watching both investments pay off simultaneously. Serena looked at me for a long moment, calculating, measuring the distance between where she was sitting and every available exit. "There are 2 agents outside," I said helpfully. "Technically, they're here at my invitation, so this is still a social occasion at the moment." I leaned forward slightly. "That changes the moment you stand up without being invited to." She didn't stand up. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a single document on the table in front of her. A cooperation agreement, prepared by the district attorney's office. Her name already printed neatly at the top. 7. The Collin family lost their retirement savings. The Merritt family's son had a breakdown. I've read every file. I held her gaze. "You're going to sit here, and you're going to sign this, and you're going to give the DA everything on Garrett Sims's operation. Every name, every account, every target you were given. And in return, the DA will take that cooperation very seriously when it matters." I sat back. "Or you don't sign it, and we do this the other way. Either works for me, honestly." Serena looked at the document, looked at me, looked at the document again, and then she did something I genuinely did not expect. She laughed, short, quiet, almost admiring. "How long?" she asked. 3 weeks, I said. She nodded slowly, the way professionals acknowledge other professionals. Then she picked up the pen I had placed beside the document, and she signed it. The agents came in through the front door 11 minutes later. Judith made them coffee, because Judith will make anyone coffee under any circumstances. And that is one of the 10,000 reasons I have loved her for 35 years. Blake waited until Serena was gone before he said anything. He sat across from me at the now quiet table, the dessert untouched, the bourbon bottle still open, and he looked at me with an expression I am going to carry with me for the rest of my life. "How did you know?" he asked. "Before I passed you the note. You already knew, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. "How long had you known?" 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "You could have told me." "I could have," I agreed. "But then you would have had to perform for 3 weeks instead of one afternoon. And you did beautifully, by the way. Your mother's composure. Definitely not mine." He looked down at the table. When he looked back up, his eyes were red at the edges. Not from sadness, I think. From the specific exhausting relief of a weight that has finally completely been set down. "I really thought," he started. "I know," I said. "For about 6 weeks, I genuinely—" "I know, son." He nodded, swallowed, pulled himself together with the quiet dignity of a young man I am extraordinarily proud of. Frank, from the corner of the room, raised his bourbon glass. "For what it's worth," Frank said, in the unhurried tone of a man who has been waiting all afternoon to say something. "The lamb was excellent. Someone with sense. They say the best revenge is living well. With respect, the best revenge is 32 years of experience, a friend with an unreadable face, a district attorney's cooperation agreement, and the good sense to invite the right people to Sunday lunch." Serena Voss's testimony brought down a 7-state operation. Garrett Sims received 14 years. 3 additional associates were indicted. The Collin family recovered 60% of their losses through asset seizure. The Merritt family was notified, and I am told the son is doing better. Blake, for his part, took 6 months off dating entirely. Sensible boy, and every Sunday, without exception, Judith still makes the roast lamb. Some traditions, after all, are worth protecting. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.